Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Tuesday, August 11th, 2020. Not a big surprise. Joe Biden has finally announced his pick for vice president to run on the Democratic ticket in November. And she is Senator Kamala Harris, the junior senator from here in California. And let me begin by saying what I think is obvious and pretty clear to everyone, that Kamala Harris, like all of the women who were considered for the choice, the selection as vice presidential running mate, Kamala Harris is smart, she is capable, and she is qualified. I do not take those elements away from her or from the many people who were vetted and considered over the past few months. And while I'm drawn to other people, Elizabeth Warren would have been an excellent pick in many respects. Karen Bass, the congresswoman from Los Angeles, earned my support. And Jennifer Granholm, the governor of Michigan, I thought offered some strong leadership in her state, a critical battleground state that the Democrats must win this year. And so I know that Joe Biden isn't listening to me. And it's one of the reasons why over the last few months I have avoided the speculation about the Veep stakes. But I view this as a setback because the Democratic Party is still captive to identity politics. And Joe Biden, at his low point in March, desperate to attract votes, boxed himself in by saying he would definitely pick a woman. And then the events of the summer boxed him in further, and the pressure was on to name a black woman. And I believe that this is an error. And there are others who agree with me. Polls show that African-American voters didn't feel that it had to be a black or a black woman as a running mate for Biden for them to support the ticket. Biden already scooped up a lot of support from black voters, starting in South Carolina in the primaries. His Lazarus-like return to political life. It was the very first primary that Biden has ever won, and this is his fourth attempt to run for president. And so from a political calculation, Joe Biden didn't need to pick a black person as his running mate. He also didn't need to pick a person from California because there is no way Trump is going to win here in November. So the calculations must be based on other matters. We're told that the chemistry between Biden and his running mate is something that he considered very important. But Chris Dodd, the former senator from Connecticut, who went on to be a highly paid lobbyist for the motion picture industry in Hollywood, he's the guy who played Dick Cheney in this race, and at least he didn't pick himself. But he is a centrist corporate type, and I'm sure he admired those qualities in Kamala Harris. And here in California, many of us just know too much about Senator Harris. She is nakedly ambitious. She is calculated to the extreme. And she didn't really attract a base of support, despite picking up the insider support of the Clinton infrastructure and the Clinton fundraising machine when she ran in the primaries last year. And she bailed out before she was tested by any voters. And that is typical of her history. Her first race for district attorney in San Francisco was a tough one, a three-way race, and she eked it out. She then sailed to re-election. She stepped up to run for attorney general statewide. Her first election was challenging. The second was a cakewalk. When she ran for the U.S. Senate, it was just a cruise. And so she is largely untested on the national stage. Ask yourself, what has Kamala Harris accomplished in the U.S. Senate? Well, for me, the most memorable moment was when she interrogated Jeff Sessions in his confirmation hearings to become Attorney General. And I loved hearing Sessions saying, "Senator, you're making me nervous." And she's really good at that kind of prosecutorial interrogation. But I don't see that as a qualification for vice president or ultimately for president. And with an elderly man at the top of the ticket, we do have to consider that this puts Kamala Harris in pole position to run for president as soon as 2024, win or lose with Biden. And on Facebook, after the announcement was made today, I scrolled through, and predictably, the corporate Democrat types, the Clinton faction of the Democratic Party, they're ecstatic. Their identity politics obsession has been addressed. But I also believe that Kamala Harris provides a rich target for racist attacks and other attacks from Trump. He's shown that there's no limit to what he will do to attack someone, to destroy them. And Kamala Harris has gotten a pass on some of the early aspects of her career when she was a line prosecutor across the bay from San Francisco in Alameda County. And she took up a relationship with the long married and long separated former mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown. And I really don't know how intimate their relationship was. They dated. We know that. Then Willie prompted her to run for district attorney to settle a score with his old nemesis, Terrence Hallinan. And she succeeded there with a whole lot of help from the friends of Willie Brown. And will their relationship be fodder for tabloids, for tabloid-style attacks from the Trump campaign? Oh, I think so. And Willie Brown is an unusual man. I've known him for over 30 years. I have a deep respect for the political animal he is, a very successful one at that. But he represents, along with Nancy Pelosi, a lefty icon that is a visible target coast to coast. And they're going to take a lot of shots at that target. They'll try to tie Harris to everything Willie Brown has ever done. And in an inexcusable breach of journalistic standards, the San Francisco Chronicle a few years back hired Willie Brown to write a Sunday column. And it's filled with political gossip and, when we had movie theaters open, Willie would do his own movie reviews every week. But he has on several occasions offered advice to his former girlfriend, most recently this past Sunday. And let me say that at least the Washington Post, when it references Amazon or Jeff Bezos, will put in parentheses in the body of the news article, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Now, it's not exactly the same. Willie Brown doesn't own the San Francisco Chronicle. But he is permitted from his perch as a once-a-week columnist to dispense advice, even to a former girlfriend, without mentioning their prior relationship. And I don't care. Willie Brown's been married to his wife Blanche for 50 years, and they have an accommodation that is none of my business. But for Brown to talk about Kamala Harris in a newspaper column without appropriate background and context, I think is a breach of journalistic standards. Nevertheless, this past Sunday, he advised Kamala that if offered the vice presidency, she should politely decline because he thinks the attorney general job would be best for her. And I might agree with Willie. So this is going to be a ride. We're going to once again revisit Kamala Harris's role as a prosecutor in San Francisco. I actually respect one of the first moves she made when she was the district attorney here. She declined to pursue the death penalty in a case where a police officer had been killed. Dianne Feinstein lowered the boom on her, and to her credit, she did not buckle under that pressure. That is the most principled stand that I can attribute to Kamala Harris in her years in public life. Most of the rest of it is calculated on how to advance her career, how to score campaign cash. And we're going to watch that play out, as you're going to hear once again that she didn't pursue Steve Mnuchin for criminal behavior when he ran a bank that foreclosed on tens of thousands of homeowners in California. She passed. He contributed. Then there's her failure, despite her opposition to the death penalty, to help promote ballot measures to end the death penalty in California. And she mostly took a hardline law and order approach to appeals from prisoners, to appeals from victims that came before her office as Attorney General. So there's a rich trove going back to San Francisco, the Willie Brown connection, her role as Attorney General in California, and her empty record as a United States Senator. So be prepared for that kind of political combat as we move toward Election Day, which is, 85 days away or so. And because there is no in-person convention in Milwaukee next week, it's kind of anticlimactic. Biden played this out, strung it out as long as he could. And here we are. So over the weekend, as you know, Trump, with a flourish at his golf club in New Jersey, signed 4 executive orders. The meaningless one about evictions that has absolutely no impact or teeth. The one about extending forbearance for student loan debtors. Not so bad. But the payroll tax cut that threatens funding for Medicare and Social Security is a stinker. And the real doozy is his claim that he could divert disaster money under the control of FEMA to state unemployment agencies that would parcel it out to unemployed Americans. He said it would be $400 a week, down from $600, the federal contribution, and that 100 of the 400 had to come from state budgets. And today, showing unusual flexibility, the White House amended the order to say, well, if the states don't have that $100, no problem. We'll just reduce the amount that goes to unemployed Americans facing hunger, eviction, foreclosure, and no prospects of their job returning anytime soon. And here in California, we can put numbers on it. In order to pay the extra $100 a week, California would need $700 million per week. And that's if they could ever get the money out. There are more than 1 million people who don't have their payments. There are another 200,000 whose cases are being reevaluated, but they won't know until the end of September. And the change up here, money coming through FEMA can only be fed to the unemployment agencies at the state level through an act of Congress. And we have a stalemate between the Democrats and the Republicans on the shape and amount of relief that is necessary at this time. So it is purely grandstanding. It's a press release. It's a stunt. And it was Larry Kudlow who has changed his message points repeatedly over the past week, who said, oh, yeah, the states can opt out of that $100 payment and just shortchange the people who desperately need it. No problem. The plutocrats, the oligarchs, they're not affected by that. And even in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the average people are bitching at their Mitch. McConnell up for re-election in November. He has a hefty lead in the polls. But the Washington Post sent a reporter over there to Kentucky, where there are protests occurring every day. They are organized by labor groups like the AFL-CIO and the Teamsters. But Kentucky needs help like any other state does. Unemployment, housing support, food subsidies, and the state and local governments are facing financial ruin. But the miserly Mitch stands there appeasing his corporate sponsors and the right-wingers in his party and turns a deaf ear to the needs of average people. Will that result in his ejection in November? And this is where the Republicans figure that people like me want misery to continue. I want people to suffer because the higher goal is to get rid of Mitch McConnell. Well, I don't want people to suffer, and I do want to get rid of Mitch McConnell. But that, of course, is not the way it will be interpreted by the spinmeisters on the right. Bit of a surprise in Seattle last night. The city council was mulling cuts to the wages of the top brass in the police department, including the chief, Carmen Best. And this came after reports, and we just had a report like this in San Francisco. When you look at the obscene amounts of overtime that police officers and leaders in law enforcement departments can earn. We have more than 20 people in San Francisco making over $450,000 a year in so-called public service. Most of that is overtime that could be managed if they hired more people. And so Carmen Best, facing a reduction in pay that would in turn reduce her pension payout, that's at least one factor, she decided to eject herself into retirement. She's only been chief for about a year and a half. And she's blaming the city council. And she doesn't make it about herself and her pension. It's about their modest efforts to cut funding to the police and reduce the number of officer positions in Seattle. And this is the same woman who a few weeks back, after the council passed restrictions on the use of tear gas and other forms of force on protesters, basically said, well, I'm going to let my officers stand down. She was letting the public be the guinea pigs in a game of chicken, I guess. That's a really bad metaphor, Peter. I'm going to have to work on that one. You can't have guinea pigs in a game of chicken. But I think you take my point, that she was allowing the public to be put at risk in an effort to settle a score between the police officers, and she was a rank-and-file, 30-year member of the Seattle PD. She was going to teach the public a lesson. And at the time, and even today, I call that a serious abdication of her responsibilities. And we need to be fair that while the council is fairly unified, there was only one vote against the budget cuts announced to the police in the budget revision adopted by the council, and that was from a council member who said they didn't go far enough. So we're going to see how this will play out and who will succeed her. There are a number of openings. The Portland police chief quit. The Oakland police chief, a black woman, got fired. And it could be a game of musical chairs, and we'll see Carmen Best show up at another police department on the West Coast sometime soon. And our eyes and ears in Seattle, Paul Leto added a little info to this. He said right-wing radio and TV news picked up the story first because they often have extremely close working relationships with the police. Even though Best had been considering retirement for some time and personally gave no reasons, the timing of the announcement has given ample room for community voices to make up reasons and impute them to the chief. And interesting statement from a Black Lives Matter group. And from my distance, I don't know who the players are here and exactly whether this is coming from a handful of leaders or some sort of consensus. But BLM says today's news of the retirement of Chief Best is a loss. It does nothing to further our fight for authentic police accountability and the safety of black lives. That the first black woman to hold the position of chief of police in Seattle has been forced out of her job by the Seattle City Council. Racism is racism. We demand the City Council stop prioritizing performative action that solely suggests the appearance of change. We demand transparency and accountability for the series of actions and inactions that led to Chief Best's resignation. And we demand a successor that serves black lives. Well, prioritizing performative action? I think that they've been trying to work with her to make significant change. And it's been pointed out to me by Paul and others that Seattle has a restriction where the police chief is not permitted to meet directly with the city council. And as a result, there has been a communication gap, a disconnect of sorts. But she, in my view, from here, never allowed any daylight between her and the police union and the rank and file of the police department that was brutalizing people on the streets of Seattle. And we can't forget that the department was under a consent decree with the Federal Justice Department over past abuses. One more comment from Paul Leto. Best has not said why she is retiring. As with the bulk of police communications, their power as propaganda is in the optical and the sub-intelligatur, which here is the assumption that the scaled-back cuts are too draconian for her to want to deal with. Her retirement is stealing the lead from the council's action before it can settle that the council got a 14% reduction in the police department budget, not the 50% that they were hoping for. So the budget amendments passed by the council are intended to shrink the police force by up to 100 officers by layoff and attrition this year, dismantle the team that removes some homeless encampments, and cut the wages of police department command staff, at least over the next few months. Council member Teresa Mosqueda described Monday's amendments as first steps toward achieving the demands by many Black Lives Matter protesters that Seattle defund the police department by 50% to invest in community programs. And that is, of course, one of the big demands of protesters, including those who occupied Capitol Hill. And it was Council member Kashama Sawant who voted against what she called an austerity package. She said the reductions were too modest, noted that the budget was balanced partly by cutting non-police projects and services. The police department reductions passed yesterday represent only $3 million in savings in this fiscal year. And a couple of statements here. This is from Decriminalize Seattle and King County Equity Now. Today, City Council inched us towards a safer future, a future where instead of using our limited taxpayer resources, salaries for cops, we allocate those funds toward data-driven, community-based solutions that we know prevent harm, not merely respond to it. While there is still much to do, we encourage the council, mayor, and the chief to endorse the overwhelmingly supported process underway toward true public safety for all Seattle residents. The resolution says that the council intends to create a new Department of Public Safety, transfer the 911 dispatch, emergency management, harbor patrol, and parking enforcement units out of the police department. And they're borrowing $17 million from other accounts for community-led budget research and to bolster community organizations that do public safety work. So that is the state of play in Seattle. Last night in Portland, there were some protesters out on the street. Once again, police declared an unlawful gathering. Not quite a riot this time. According to the Oregonian newspaper, no apparent property damage was observed. 9 people were arrested. And again, the focus was on the North Precinct. This was the 75th consecutive night of protest in Portland. And Oregon lawmakers, responding to the pressure from the street, have passed a law, not yet signed by the governor, further restricting the use of chokeholds by police. It requires officers give those they are questioning a verbal warning and reasonable opportunity to comply before using physical force, and only in cases of self-defense. They define chokeholds as impeding normal breathing or circulation of blood of another person by applying pressure on throat or neck. It requires officers to consider alternatives to physical force. I think we can say that's some progress. This is a setback. Protesters in Milwaukee attacked a black officer who was on leave after he fatally shot a teenager in February. They vandalized his girlfriend's home. They discharged a shotgun at his back door. The officer, who is on leave, he's suspended, probably with pay, is named Joseph Mensah, M-E-N-S-A-H. He's with the Wauwatosa Police Department in suburban Milwaukee. He tried to establish a dialogue with the group of protesters, but was ultimately physically assaulted outside his home. And after he went back indoors, armed protesters went to his back door and shot around at the house shortly after 8 p.m. And he posted on Facebook, "We were both assaulted," referring to his girlfriend, punched, ultimately shot at several times. A shotgun round missed me by inches. The irony in all of this is that they chanted Black Lives Matter the entire time, but had zero regard for any of the black children that live there, or me, a black man. This is vigilantism, and I do not support it. Meanwhile, in Virginia, in Henrico County, a self-proclaimed Ku Klux, that's always a tongue twister, Ku Klux Klan president, was found guilty of intentionally driving into a racial justice protest, but not of the hate crime charges that were added later. A judge on Monday found Rogers, what's his first name here? Well, we don't get his first name in this article, I'm sorry. His last name is Rogers. Guilty of 4 misdemeanor assault charges, 2 additional property crimes in the incident at the protest outside Richmond in June. And the judge sentenced Rogers to 12 months each on the 6 misdemeanor charges. That's 6 years. That's a pretty substantial sentence. They used cell phone data, the prosecutors did, to show that the suspect stalked the Lakeside Avenue site before the scheduled protest. They played a Facebook Live video where Rogers said he was proud of driving through the group. And they did find what's called a Klan Bible in his car, And that was one of the elements used to support the hate crimes charges. And this is another indication of the rogue nature of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. Yesterday in Santa Clarita, which is at the north end of Los Angeles County, 3 black teens were held at gunpoint by cops, only they were the victims in the incident that had led to the 911 call that brought police to the scene. And there's a video. It showed a tense situation where the 3 young black people were handcuffed one by one with firearms pointed in their direction as bystanders pleaded with the deputies to de-escalate, asserting that these 3 were actually the victims. It's not them. Multiple people can be heard yelling, "Put your guns down. They're kids. They weren't doing anything." Another woman is heard telling the teens to keep your hands up, put your hands up. Not clear if that's a police officer, a female. And another woman who identifies herself as the manager of a nearby Buffalo Wild Wings tells the deputies she's the one who called 911, saying she reported there's a male Hispanic outside the parking lot chasing 3 African-American kids with a knife. Quote, "There's a crazy man running around our parking lot chasing kids, trying to stab them, and you come here and approach the kids that we're trying to help like that with guns. And the crazy man is running down the street with a knife." I can't explain that. The American Civil Liberties Union and its National Executive Director, Anthony Romero, have amplified the call to dismantle the Department of Homeland Security and to pick a new name. Romero said its dysfunction is one of the worst-kept secrets of the Beltway. He wrote an op-ed published in USA Today, said that its overbroad mandate and unchecked powers have turned it into a tinderbox, now ignited by a president willing to trample on constitutional limits of presidential powers. He writes, "The very premise of a, quote, homeland security, end quote, bureaucracy is chilling and ought to be questioned." Noting that DHS is an ineffective super agency composed of 22 different agencies, Romero argued that breaking up the department would allow for more effective oversight, accountability, and public transparency. And the recent deployment of Homeland Security goons, particularly in Portland, has led to sharp criticism of the agency, even from the first Homeland Security boss, Tom Ridge, a Republican. And commenting on Portland, he said, "It would be a cold day in hell before I would consent or agree to the unsolicited, uninvited intervention in any of my cities. I certainly don't favor that kind of action, and I don't think DHS was designed for that purpose to start with." And retired California Senator Barbara Boxer had one of these comments that makes you cringe. She said, "I never thought that a Department of Homeland Security would be used against our own people." Really, Barbara? Now, I've had my ups and downs with Senator Boxer over the years. I generally respect the work that she did in Washington. But there are moments like this where her vision was deeply flawed. And she got caught up in the hysteria following 9/11, made a lot of bad decisions when she voted, including related to Homeland Security. Kevin Gosztola, the great young reporter who publishes at his own site Shadowproof, brings us up to date on some action in Congress. There's legislation that would fill multiple gaps in federal whistleblower protections and finally grant access to courts and jury trials for review of their cases. And it is ironic, as he notes, that this court access was removed when President Obama signed into law the 2012 Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act, which didn't enhance very much. And Obama really was brutal on whistleblowers, as we know. But a group that calls itself the Make It Safe Coalition Steering Committee is praising the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, chaired by Carolyn Maloney, for a new bill that would provide this court access. And the members of this group are the Government Accountability Project, Liberty Coalition, National Security Counselors, National Whistleblower Center, POGO, the Project on Government Oversight, Public Citizen, Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Whistleblowers of America. Now, this is an important step forward, and it deals with the arcane machinery of the government that is a failure. Have you ever heard of the Merit Systems Protection Board? Well, I learned about it from Sibel Edmonds and from Joe Carson, our listener and longtime Energy Department whistleblower. And from my read, this legislation would strengthen the hand of Joe Carson. He has been tilting at the Merit System Protection Board for a long time, and currently there isn't even a single member of this panel. There's supposed to be 2 from the president's party and 1 from the other party. And so it's completely inoperative. That's another piece that has to be fixed. And the other element that is missing here is extending the same protection to national security whistleblowers. But that is too heavy a lift at a time when Democrats and Republicans are united in the dubious protection of secrets and the secret operation of government agencies. Here in California, a Superior Court judge granted a preliminary injunction to make Uber and Lyft drivers into employees. This is a very important step because Uber and Lyft have dropped over $100 million for a statewide initiative to legalize their illegal business models. And they're illegal because they pretend that their drivers are not independent contractors. I mean, they pretend that they are independent contractors when they don't meet the IRS criteria for independent contractors. Judge Ethan Schulman flatly says that Lyft and Uber drivers are employees, and they have to be offered the benefits of unemployment, of workplace workers' compensation. So the response from Lyft is not a legal argument. They say drivers do not want to be employees. We'll immediately appeal this ruling and continue to fight for their independence. No, it's not their independence. It's your efforts to exploit them and to pay them as little as possible as they provide their own vehicles, insurance, and gasoline in order to earn the modest fees that these companies allow their drivers to earn. Uber said the same thing. The vast majority of drivers want to work independently. We've already made significant changes to our app to ensure that that remains the case under California law. But the judge said that there's an overwhelming likelihood that the lawsuit from the state attorney general would prevail on the claim that Lyft and Uber are misclassifying their drivers. Defendants' contrary arguments lack merit, calling out glaring inconsistencies such as the company saying that the new law, AB 5, does not apply to them, even as Uber filed a suit saying that AB 5 had targeted it. So they're throwing up any argument they can, and they even asked for a delay until they can try to ram through their ballot measure, and the judge said, no way. He said defendants are not entitled to an indefinite postponement of their day of reckoning. None of defendants' pleas for further delay is persuasive. So I think that will be tied up in the courts until after the election, and we'll see how California voters choose to decide that. Well, as you know, traffic on the airlines is at an all-time low. But it appears that those who are flying are carrying their guns at record levels. Now, the TSA doesn't catch all the guns that people have in their carry-on bags, but they have found a lot more than in the past. So, in July, the agency confiscated 15.3 guns per million passengers. And a year ago, it found 5.1 guns per million people screened. And this is with 75% fewer passengers compared to last year. 80% of the firearms coming into the checkpoint are loaded. I mean, what are these people thinking? I will admit that there's sometimes things in my bag that I didn't recall, like a bottle of wine. But I don't have a gun, so I guess I can't quite say that if I did, I would know where it is at all times. So the favorite airports for the gun-packing travelers: Hartsfield, Jackson, Atlanta, Denver International, and Dallas-Fort Worth International. It's another one of those delayed primary days. Minnesota voters will decide whether Ilhan Omar returns to Congress, as she's been targeted with a massive spending campaign by allies of the State of Israel, and they're promoting a candidate named Anton Melton Mew, who raised $3.2 million last quarter from critics of Congresswoman Omar around the nation. So we'll see if she survives. And she's gotten some help from Cori Bush, the woman who dramatically unseated William Lacey Clay, Jr., in the St. Louis suburbs last week. Bob Dreyfus is a great reporter. He primarily works for The Nation. And while I disagree with Bob about Russiagate, I respect his reporting, particularly on Iran. And publishing today at Tom Dispatch, I've linked to his commentary in the show file for today's podcast. He asks if Donald Trump will spring an October surprise by launching into a hot war with Iran. And he notes that there have been a wave of unusual explosions and fires in Iran. And so far, I have linked those without proof to Israel. But Dreyfus suspects that the U.S. could be involved as well. He says June 26, huge explosion in the area of a major Iran military and weapons development base east of Tehran. July 15th, 7 ships caught fire at an Iranian shipyard. Other mysterious fires and explosions have hit industrial facilities, a power plant, a missile production factory. He correctly notes the absurdity of the U.S. position, asking the United Nations to extend an embargo, sanctions on weapons exports to Iran that were part of the Iranian nuclear agreement that the U.S. has breached. And that not only Russia and China promised to veto such a resolution, but America's European allies are opposed to it as well. A lot of good comments in here, so check out the Dreyfus piece when you have a chance. In Belarus, we reported yesterday on the absurd victory claim of longtime strongman Alexander Lukashenko. He said he got 80% of the vote. Well, now, the woman who stepped in when her husband was locked up to be the figurehead of the opposition, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, she has abruptly been ejected from Belarus and has shown up in neighboring Lithuania. In a video released today, she appeared to have recorded under duress. Tikhanovskaya read from a prepared text calling on Belarusians not to resist the police or to protest in public squares in order not to put yourselves at risk. I made this decision absolutely independently, she said in another cryptic video message. I know that many will understand me, many will judge me, many will hate me for it, but know that God forbid you will face the kind of choice that I faced. And police continue to battle protesters for a second night on Monday, and they say that 2,000 people have been arrested. The New York Times reports that an American contractor working with the U.S. Army warned at least 4 years ago about that large cache of potentially explosive ammonium nitrate stored in the port of Beirut. Current and former American officials who've worked in the Mideast say that the contractor probably reported that finding to the U.S. Embassy or to the Pentagon, and news of that report surfaced only last Friday. The Times says that the United States may have known, the fact that the U.S. may have known about the chemicals and warned no one, shocked and angered Western diplomats who lost 2 colleagues in the blast and saw several others wounded. So this raises the question of how wide the knowledge was that Lebanese officials, in a form of gross negligence, had not moved this seized cargo before it either blew up in an accidental manner or was targeted by nefarious actors. Now, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, on loan from Raytheon, said the American government is still unsure about what had caused the accident, and then, after saying that, said, well, it might have been a Hezbollah arms shipment that blew up. But as we reported yesterday from Pepe Escobar, it's very clear that Hezbollah didn't control the port, and it's pretty clear that they didn't have any kind of an arms cache in that area. And in a contradictory follow-up paragraph here, the Times reports Hezbollah is known to be careful with its weapons caches and explosive material. If they were using the ammonium nitrate at the port for their own purposes, it would be unusual for them to store it so carelessly. However, an Israeli official said that the area of the port where the blast occurred was full of Hezbollah facilities. But from other reports, that appears to be falsely incorrect. I mean, flatly incorrect is the way I want to put it. More speculation on the cause of the blast in Beirut from Mint Press News and reporter Raul Diego. He says that narrative that puts Hezbollah in the hot seat, got to turn the page, has a few holes in it, to say the least. The mainstream U.S.-led international media beats the drums with the drums of war with commercial breaks in between. They are relying on a few key stories to hang Lebanon's most popular political body and lock mainstream news consumers' sights squarely on Hassan Nasrallah, the third leader of Lebanon's anti-Zionist party Hezbollah, as the ultimate target of the next modern-day crusade in the Middle East. And he goes on to list events over the past few years where Hezbollah has been blamed for incidents that it had no connection to. So it appears that this is the propaganda move, and it's one that is probably going to stick, because Israeli propaganda is remarkably effective. Here's today's COVID-19 update, prepared by Linda Lewis. She starts with a BBC report. Russian President Putin has said that a locally developed vaccine for COVID-19 called Sputnik V has been given regulatory approval after less than 2 months of testing on humans. He said the vaccine had passed all the required checks, saying that one of his daughters has already taken the vaccine. Amid fears that safety could have been compromised, the World Health Organization urged Russia to follow international guidelines for producing a vaccine. The WHO said today it had been in talks with Russian authorities about undertaking a review of the vaccine, which is not among their list of 6 vaccines that have reached Phase 3 clinical trials. And one quote attributed to Putin was that it is safe enough. So clearly, this is a rush to be first. I think that the value of being first is dubious, and that this, unfortunately, sets a model for Donald Trump to try to rush through a vaccine at what he calls warp speed. Damn the consequences. Because he only cares about getting reelected, and after that, when people die, you're not going to be able to do anything to him or hold him responsible. Yesterday, we reported with some positive spin that New Zealand had really snuffed out the virus. Only about 20 people reported with active infections in the entire country. But as a result of new testing, New Zealand has confirmed the first case of community transmission in over 100 days, 4 cases in one family. So the the major city of Auckland is going into alert level 3 starting midday Wednesday. Aucklanders are encouraged to stay home, wear masks when they're out. The rest of New Zealand will go into alert level 2 starting on Wednesday. The government is urgently trying to work out where the case came from. They have no link to the border or overseas travel, and so they're going to use the next period of time to roll out a testing blitz. The index case, the first one that the government found out about, is a man in his 50s in South Auckland. He was swabbed on Monday after displaying symptoms for 5 days. There is no immediate link that we have found as yet to a managed isolation facility, no connection to a high-risk person, such as those who work at the border, said the Prime Minister Ardern. And so we're going to see if they're able to control this with the responses that they are implementing. In another example of his obsession with border control, Trump has announced that he's considering new immigration rules that would allow border officials to temporarily block an American citizen or legal resident from returning to the United States from abroad, and he seems to be focused exclusively on the southern border in another effort to promote his wall as a way of keeping a virus out. That, of course, is irrational, but he's pretty good at that. A draft regulation would expand government's power to prevent entry by citizens and legal residents if an official reasonably believes that the individual either may be exposed to or is infected with the communicable disease. And legal experts are questioning the proposal's constitutionality, like so many things that come from Trump. Epidemiologist Alexandra Feathers writes in Stat News today about how her concerns as a medical school employee and the mother of a school-aged child about the readiness of schools to reopen. The medical school plan is to follow the basic script seen in school reopening strategies all over the country. Frequently sanitized high-touch surfaces, 6-foot distances, unidirectional hallways, reduced capacity elevators and classrooms. But the primary way COVID-19 is transmitted, experts now say, is through airborne micro-droplets. The capricious nature of air circulation and the lack of filtration systems in our already underfunded public school systems is absent from the conversation. And I will say that here in California, because we have pretty decent weather and, it rarely freezes in most places in the winter, our school facilities are really pretty Spartan, and many of them have very basic heating systems, but no air conditioning and no air filtration. So I do think that this is a significant issue, and I'm glad it's being raised, probably a little too late for the school year, which is already getting underway in some jurisdictions. And speaking of schools, I'm hearing stories of people I know who have, pretty good financial means, who are facing the reality that their kids' schools are not going to be in the classroom this fall. And they are looking for alternatives that are pretty dramatic. One family I know that moved to the Bay Area from Jackson Hole, Wyoming, is investigating whether they could return to Jackson and enroll their kids there at least this fall, because apparently the schools there and the level of infection and other factors will permit classrooms to reopen. Also, the parents of a special needs child whose programs are not going to be operating this fall, they're thinking of moving in with their parents in San Diego, where there is a program for a special needs child that is on-site and not virtual or remote. So it is a very significant set of issues. Here in California, the top public health official submitted her resignation yesterday, taking the fall for the screw-up with the data collection. The state misplaced about 300,000 lab results over a 10-day period around the end of July, and they're claiming they've got it all cleaned up and that it didn't change the trajectory or the flattening of the curve in any significant way. But Dr. Sonia Angel has resigned, and Governor Newsom has appointed an interim replacement. I want to thank Dick Atlee for sharing a link to a drug that may show some promise for treating the novel coronavirus. It's called ivermectin, and in a report that has not cleared peer review, I want to be clear about that, it is described as an inhibitor of the COVID-19 causative virus in vitro. A single treatment is able to effect a minus 5,000-fold reduction in the virus after 48 hours in cell culture. Ivermectin or ivermectin is an FDA-approved drug for parasitic infections, therefore has a potential for repurposing, and it doesn't list any potential side effects here, but I would argue that those would be known in relation to a drug that has been in circulation. And it says that ivermectin is widely available due to its inclusion on the World Health Organization model list of essential medicines. So we'll keep an eye out for that and see if it shows any further promise. Meanwhile, researchers have collected air samples. I should tie this to the previous story about classroom air quality. And they were able to collect the virus. They went into the clinics where COVID-19 patients are being treated, and the virus collection occurred at distances of 7 to 16 feet from the patients themselves. And it doesn't say whether some of them expelled their mucus by coughing or sneezing, but that is a cautionary piece of data. And yesterday, for the second day in a row, we showed a sharp decline in the number of new deaths reported, 537, and the number of new cases reported on August 10th was 47,000. That is a drop of 18% in the past 2 weeks, and I hope that those are good indications that we are starting to get things under control at this point. I don't know about you, but in our house, Kathy and I have talked about ways of taking a road trip, trying to get in a little mini vacation this summer. But we always end up saying, do we want to stay in a hotel or a motel where we don't know who stayed there the night before, how well it was sanitized when the housekeeper cleaned it? And we're not alone, because many people have these concerns, and the hospitality industry, the hotels, are trying to address it. And CDC studies show that people infected with the virus shed it on pillowcases, the bedspreads, sheets, light switches, bathroom door, faucet handles, and the TV remote. And so Wyndham Hotels has a new ad campaign called Count on Us. They brag about hospital-grade cleaning products that they use and overt shows of sanitation. This article includes a photo of a Hilton hotel where they put these kind of stickers on the door. Remember, they used to put a little strip of paper across the toilet seat saying that it had been sanitized. Well, these seals are going on the door of the hotel room to indicate that they have been thoroughly cleaned. So I don't have a solution to this, but I have put up a link to this New York Times article. And if you've been wrestling with some of the same issues, take a gander. And finally today, we know that our intelligence community, the corporate media, and hysterical Democrats are warning us that Russia wants to influence American voters through nefarious means, misinformation and disinformation. But I have a pair of stories here, starting with this report in today's Washington Post. Because disinformation is being promoted by a Florida company because they make money off it. They run sites that have, cheesy news reports. One is called The Bearded Patriot, the other The Wolf of Washington. The websites tell of nonstop riots, crazed leftists. They warn of online censorship, the wiles of George Soros. The material is tailor-made to inflame right-wing positions, but the underlying purpose is to collect email addresses and other personal information from the people who visit the site and then sell that so that they can be preyed upon by political entities or others who may want to sell them a Yo Semite t-shirt or a Make America Great Again hat. And they detail that after an investigation, it's exposed that a guy named Mark Evans Jr., a self-proclaimed online multimillionaire, has 178 sites. At least half of them are politically themed. They share visual as well as technical features, and it's all designed to harvest email addresses. And then there's a case exposed by BuzzFeed today in a too-long article that I couldn't quite get to the end of. But it explains that in Troy, New York, which is part of the Tri-Cities, Albany, Troy, Schenectady, there is a story that has surfaced where Black Lives Matter protesters went into a fundamentalist Baptist church. And the video footage shows one of the demonstrators calling a church member a dumb fuck. And this has produced a predictable reaction from Dinesh D'Souza, Nigel Farage, Laura Ingraham, The Daily Wire, The Blaze, PJ Media. And they are using this to depict the radical left wing attacking devout Christians. But a local, quoted in the article, says, everyone here knows that this church is our Westboro Baptist. And you know, that's the family out in Kansas that is extremely radical and conducts these weird ceremonies protesting at funerals of soldiers killed in our wars of choice. But now there is a video circulating that was shot on the day that the church was hosting its second AR-15 raffle. And this connects with Trump's bizarre statement against Biden the other day about how Biden hates God and guns. Well, the pastor at this joint, John Colitas, he calls himself a bigot who's preached against interracial marriage, defends use of the N-word, believes black people as descendants are cursed by God. He calls Black Lives Matter protesters savages. He places a pork product, ham or hot dogs, at the door, requires all church attendees to touch that to ward off would-be jihadists. He abhors feminists, gay people. He hates Catholics, thinks Muslims shouldn't be allowed in the country. And those are the Christian values that are being protected against the left-wing radicals of Black Lives Matters in the spun-up distortion of the far right. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You're free to share it all over the dang place. You'll find it on YouTube. And I'm still Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.